In the new book, A Nation Astray, Nomadism and National Identity in Russian Literature, Ingrid Kleespies takes a look at Russian literature through the lens of the vastness of Russia and how the wandering culture shaped all aspects of life in the 19th century. She reviews works by authors such as Dostoyevsky and Pushkin in her quest to better understand the commonalities of Russian literature of the time. Ingrid Kleespies is also an assistant professor in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures at the University of Florida, and she's a senior fellow at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. She joins us now. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, what made you want to write this book on Russian literature viewed through national identity and wandering around and nomads? So this seems like a novel take on looking at literature.
Well, thank you. This is a really interesting question. And I guess I would say there are probably a couple of different reasons why I came to this topic, partly scholarly and partly personal. But I was originally very interested in travel writing and the idea of Russians as travelers to the West and also as travelers to their own East within Russia itself. But this interest kind of morphed or developed into the idea of the metaphor of the traveler and the metaphor of the nomad as symbols of Russian national identity in the 19th century and even in the 20th and I would say 21st century as well. So in that sense, it was a kind of a scholarly interest, but it also stemmed from my own personal interest in traveling and in nomadic cultures, sort of the real thing. And so in that sense, it was a happy marriage of two different kinds of interests that I have.
And when you think about the vastness of Russia, and you have so many different types of people from the Caucasus regions to Siberia to, a more European feel, how is it that these totally disparate societies are connected through these authors and through this nomadic culture?
Well, that's also a really an interesting question, and I think in part the answer lies in the question itself, which is to say that Russia is a very diverse space physically and a very diverse space culturally. It's a multinational empire. I'm talking about Russia in the 19th century in particular. And yes, the challenge is what sense do you make of that as a Russian writer writing in the Romantic period or in the mid-19th century? How do you knit it all together? And in fact, it's very difficult to do that. And one way you knit that together is actually thinking about the way it doesn't necessarily hold together, which is to say that there's a kind of nomadic identity and identity that can shift and change. And I do just want to stress that, of course, this is metaphorical. I don't mean that 19th century Russians were actually nomadic. What I mean is that they saw themselves in relation to the West and in relation to their own kind of vast and in some ways undefined space as nomadic wanderers, as people not connected to space or as a people not connected to a specific national culture. And that this was one of the ways in which to deal with it was to adopt or even kind of take pride in a nomadic sense of the self and a sense of the nation as nomadic.
We talk about Russian self-determination, this kind of feeling like they're on their own and they can't really depend on the rest of the world to come in and help because perhaps no one really can understand them.
Yes, I think that is certainly a persistent kind of feeling about Russia and one that is both a lack and a positive feature of Russian identity, the way that it's perceived. So it's in the sense that we're isolated, we're cut off from the West, both physically by space, but also because of our history. But at the same time, this then kind of becomes a kind of almost special identity, right? That is, this is something positive that we have that the rest of the world lacks. And I think it does kind of this sense of like, who else could understand this? The British Empire is a completely different animal from the Russian Empire, so to speak. Yes, I would agree.
And yet when you have a writer like Dostoyevsky, who many consider one of the best writers of all time, he was able to find themes that had a universality to it that connected with everybody, not just Russians. How were they able to do that, to find ways, even feeling isolated, to connect with the rest of the world?
Well, I think, it's always this double-pronged thing, which is that Russians, especially, say, a writer like Dostoyevsky, at this one hand sees sort of Russian specialness or distinctness from Europe, let's say, is really the West that we're talking about here. And then at the same time, this is a kind of difference from Europe, but still within the idea or the sphere of European influence. So they're constantly reacting against Europe, but within European parameters. And so I would say something like this symbol or this image of the nomad, it comes from Romanticism more generally. This isn't a kind of just a Russian invention. I mean, lots of Romantic writers, Goethe and Byron and Coleridge, are very interested in wandering and alienation and these kinds of ideas. Yet these sort of English poets would see this more as a kind of statement about the individual experience of the world. Where in Russia, where it becomes really interesting is that it's not really just about the individual anymore. It's about the nation, and the nation as a kind of collective of individuals. And so that's where I would say someone like Dostoyevsky as a writer is able to connect to the larger human experience, but at the same time really define and almost kind of create a very unique Russian experience within that.
Why did you choose to center in the 19th century?
Well, that's my particular field, and I frankly just find it fascinating. I really love the 19th century, and in particular Romanticism and how it developed in Russia in the Russian context in the early 19th century and the mid-19th century. But that's not to say there's anything wrong with the 20th or the 21st century, but I think that 19th century moment of kind of the first steps of national self-determination and really kind of Russia becoming aware of its role on the world stage is really, really fascinating to me. So,
because so much happens, of course, when the end of the Russian Revolution and the beginning of communism. I mean, that's such a time when so many scholars focus on that period. But this one, you said, was not necessarily one of upheaval, but maybe one of an awakening.
Yeah, I would say an awakening, but sort of a distressing awakening in many ways. I think in the Russian context, it was a time of tremendous achievement, but also sort of self-doubt. And it was also a time of tremendous physical expansion. I mean, that was when the Russian Empire was expanding all the way across Siberia and into the Caucasus and everything else. And this, of course, through the question of, well, what is the Russian nation in the context of this empire? What does it mean? Into a really stark light. And that really, really fascinates me. I'd also say that one component of my research is thinking about how these 19th century discourses, say, of being nomadic, of being alienated, et cetera, how they actually do come into play in the revolutionary period of the early 20th century, that these were kind of long-running ideas about what it meant to be Russian that actually were sort of tapped or kind of came to the surface in the revolution as well. If you're familiar with, say, Alexander Blok, the 20th century poet who wrote the famous poem saying about the Russians, yes, we are Scythians, and sort of we are nomads, just this force of revolution waiting to come and attack Europe. So he certainly tapped into this earlier idea about the Russians as nomadic. And so I was really interested in looking at the origins. Where did that idea come from?
Well, also, we talked about earlier about pride and having this national identity, which is maybe sometimes hard to really feel when it's such a vast area. But I know during World War II, when the Soviets were having trouble with leadership, there was a sense people were more enthusiastic about fighting for Russia than for this idea of a Soviet Union and this idea of feeling a sense of connection to Russia as a country rather than, this large area. How did people really feel with their identity, and how did these writers kind of tap into this dual nature of feeling connected to their homeland, but also to this larger idea of what it means to be in this vast area?
Well, yeah, again, this is a really interesting question, and I think the topic of Russian vastness is one that is, not to put a pun on it, but vastly interesting. It's really an issue. In the early 19th century writing, there's a very famous Russian philosopher, Pyotr Chadaev, who is actually one of my key figures who I consider who wrote a very famous or infamous letter describing Russian identity. And it's a letter of negatives. It's saying everything that Russia is not. And he even goes so far as to say Russians are nomads. They're actually worse than nomads. Real nomads are more attached to their land than we are. And he really makes a point about saying that vastness is a problem. It means a lack of definition, a lack of borders. There's nothing to hold you in and give you a sense of who you are. And Chadaev is not alone in sort of talking about this as a problem. And of course, immediately you have the response to that. People like Pushkin and other writers say, well, actually the vastness it's not such a problem, right? We have this kind of infinite expanse. We can keep on going forever. It makes us powerful. But I think there has been this kind of double-sided debate in Russian culture and Russian thought for, several hundred years. What does it mean? And the vastness certainly can be a real negative, a real absence or lack of definition when we think of a kind of a typical European nation like Switzerland or France. I mean, there's a clear kind of territory. Parts of it may have been disputed at times, but in general there is a kind of core territory that's associated with it. When we get to the case of Russia, really there is a kind of idea of ancient medieval Rus, but that's a long time ago, and it's really kind of hard to draw those hard and fast boundaries about what is the homeland, what's the nation, versus what is just kind of imperial space, or what is actually just empty space. So.
And how does this idea of trying to find connectiveness to where you live translate into the dichotomy between living in an urban area versus a rural area in Russia? Because when you live in a city, you have that strong connection to that city itself, whereas perhaps if you live in the country, you may feel more of a larger national connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's and I think very interesting in the Russian case. I would say most Russians would probably agree. You have Moscow and you have Petersburg, and then you have everything else, right? So there's kind of a very strong sense of what is the center, the capital city and St. Petersburg, and then there's sort of the provinces, which are everything else. And interestingly, I think that regionalism in Russian literature, for example, is not as developed as you might expect. There is a kind of body of literature, Siberian literature, for example, and there's sort of literature of the plains and the steppe, but it's maybe not quite as developed as we'd say maybe in the American context. We have sort of like literature of the West, literature of the South. These are very sort of defined genres, and I think that certainly in the Russian Federation you have much more of a kind of a divide between who lives in the center and who lives not in the center. And that's a kind of, I guess, maybe a stronger divide than we would see elsewhere.
Well, too, even now when you look at St. Petersburg and you look at it as being a hub of artists and of cultural life in Russia, did you have a sense even in the 19th century that these cities were just drawing those with the creative fervor in them to seek out like-minded people, and that they were kind of depleting the countryside of these minds?
Well, yes, absolutely, and then especially in the time period that I write about. I mean, you couldn't really be a writer unless you were in St. Petersburg. I mean, it was very clear that you had to be in that center. You had to be around the other artists and writers. You had to have some access to kind of court circles and power, and really just to kind of the center of modern life. And of course, I'm speaking a little bit in general terms, but you really had to be in the center in order to participate in that world.
You talk about how this feeling, this vastness, isn't really felt in other places in Europe, but you have writers. I'm thinking of someone like Kerouac in America, where they do talk about the vastness, the expanse of the United States. Is there a connection then between some American writers, I don't know, like Mark Twain or something like that, or others in the 19th century, and Russian writers because they lived in such big countries?
That's actually a really interesting question, and it actually touches a little bit on my current research project, which is about the idea of Siberia as a frontier in the 19th century. And I'm really interested in the overlap between American perceptions of the frontier and America as a frontier nation and Russian perceptions of itself as a kind of constantly expanding frontier. I would say that this is maybe somewhat unexplored. It's interesting to think about someone like a Mark Twain and who his Russian counterpart might be. I think that there are sort of a different conception in the U.S. The vastness and the frontier have typically been framed, largely in really positive terms, that this is this kind of energy that's given to the so-called American character by this expansion. Whereas in the Russian case, we have a lot more of the other side of that coin, which is, this vastness is troubling because it doesn't have any borders and it's not defined. So I think in general in American literature, we don't tend to perceive of that bigness as so much problematic as positive, whereas in the Russian context, we get much more of a conflicted relationship to that space.
And why is that?
That's a great question. I think it's a historical answer. I mean, I think these are such different histories, and in the Russian case, the as Russia emerged as both a nation and an empire in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, was emerging against the border with Europe. And so it's very much always in a kind of discussion or conversation about whether it's part of Europe, whether it's going to be a European nation. And at the same time, it's clearly not. It's the biggest country on earth. It's about 10 times bigger than any European nation. So it doesn't quite fit that model. And the U.S. Is really a different history. It's sort of not right up against Europe in the same way physically, and it's not defining itself that way. And from the beginning, the idea of America as something that's growing and as something that's new is there. Whereas in Russia, you have, again, this kind of contest or tension over whether it's something new and growing or something old and static. So I think that, I think there's a lot of sort of historical reasons for that difference.
What's something that someone who perhaps is new to kind of what you're talking about, what's some books that you would recommend?
That's a great question. I would recommend, for starters, and it sounds a little counterintuitive, but I would recommend Ivan Goncharov's novel from 1859 called Oblomov, which is about a famous or infamous, if you will, Russian character who never gets out of bed and doesn't go anywhere, but in fact is kind of trapped by the vastness of the nation that he's in and the sort of uncertainty of his identity and his status as a Russian. So, and that's a fun read, and it's kind of, I like to think of it as a sleeper novel. It's about someone who sleeps a lot, but also it's not as well known in the West, and it's a wonderful book. I would also suggest Nikolai Gogol's Dead Souls, which is a wonderful, I don't talk about that in my book, but it's a wonderful novel, and it's very much about Russian space, particularly the provinces and kind of Russian space as somewhat magical, but also as difficult and problematic. And, of course, some of the less maybe fictional pieces, but I would suggest Pushkin's Journey to Erzurum, which is a really wonderful travel account that he wrote of his journey down to the south towards the Caucasus. Alexander Herzen's memoir, My Past and Thoughts, is also, it's a large project, but there's a lot of interesting discussion of Russia, more philosophical perhaps, but also quite interesting. So those are some ones to get started. I could go on all day since I'm a Russian professor, but I will spare.
Well, those are good ones to start off with, and thanks so much for taking a look at this part of Russian literature and looking at this in this different lens. I think it's interesting to kind of think about things and put them into context when you compare them under one guise of, okay, we're going to think about the vastness, and it's a kind of an interesting way to get into the literature that I don't think has been explored before.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. That's a wonderful opportunity to speak on your show, and especially to have someone be so interested in the topic.
That's Ingrid Anne Kleespies. Her new book is called A Nation Astray, Nomadism and National Identity in Russian Literature. She is also an assistant professor in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures at the University of Florida.